Good morning, Mr. Daldis here with your Chapter 18, Section 2 reading, The French Revolution Unfolds. Excitement, wonder, and fear engulfed France as the revolution unfolded at home and spread abroad. Historians divide this revolutionary era into different phases. The moderate phase of the National Assembly from 1789 to 1791 turned France into a constitutional monarchy. A radical phase, 1792 to 1794, of escalating violence led to the end of the monarchy and the Reign of Terror. There followed a period of reaction against extremism known as the Directory from 1795 to 1799. Finally, the Age of Napoleon, 1799 to 1815, consolidated many revolutionary changes. In this section, you will read about the moderate phase of the French Revolution. Political crisis leads to revolt. The political crisis of 1789 coincided with the worst famine in memory. Starving peasants roamed the countryside or flocked to towns, where they swelled the ranks of the unemployed. As grain prices soared, even people with jobs had to spend as much as 80% of their income on bread. Rumors create the Great Fear. In such desperate times, rumors ran wild and set off what was later called the Great Fear. Tales of attacks on villages and towns spread panic. Other rumors asserted that government troops were seizing peasant crops. Inflamed by famine and fear, peasants unleashed their fury on the nobles who were trying to reimpose medieval dues. Defiant peasants set fire to old manor records and stole grain from storehouses. The attacks died down after a period of time, but they clearly demonstrated peasants' anger with an unjust regime. Paris Commune comes to power. Paris, too, was in turmoil. As capital and chief city of France, it was the revolutionary center. A variety of factions, or dissenting groups of people, competed to gain power. Moderates looked to Marquis de Lafayette, the aristocratic hero of two worlds, who fought alongside George Washington in the American Revolution. Lafayette headed to the National Guard, a largely middle-class militia organization in response to the arrival of royal troops in Paris. The Guard was the first group to don the tricolore, a red, white, and blue badge that was eventually adopted as the national flag of France. A more radical group, the Paris Commune, replaced the royalist government of the city. It would mobilize whole neighborhoods for protests or violent action to further the revolution. Newspapers and political clubs, many even more radical than the Commune, blossomed everywhere. Some demanded an end to the monarchy and spread scandalous stories about the royal family and the members of the court. Checkpoint. What caused French peasants to revolt against nobles? The National Assembly Acts. Peasant uprisings and the storming of the Bastille stampeded the National Assembly into action. On August 4, in a combative all-night meeting, nobles in the National Assembly voted to end their own privileges. They agreed to give up their old manor dues, exclusive hunting rights, special legal status, and exemption from taxes. Special privilege ends. Feudalism is abolished, announced the proud and weary delegates at 2 a.m., as the president of the assembly later observed. We may view this moment as the dawn of a new revolution, when all the burdens weighing the people were abolished and France was truly reborn. Were nobles sacrificing much of their votes on the night of August 4? Both contemporary observers and modern historians note the nobles gave up nothing that had not already lost. Nevertheless, in the months ahead, the National Assembly turned the reforms of August 4 into law, meeting a key Enlightenment goal, the equality of all male citizens before the law. Declaration of the Rights of Man. In late August, as a first step towards writing a constitution, the Assembly issued the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen. The document was modeled in part on the American Declaration of Independence, written 13 years earlier. All men, the French Declaration announced, were born and remained free and equal in rights. They enjoyed natural rights to liberty, property, security, and resistance to opposition. Like the writings of Locke and the philosophers, the Constitution insisted that governments exist to protect their natural rights of citizens. The Declaration further proclaimed that all male citizens were equal before the law. Every French man had an equal right to hold public office with no distinction other than that their virtues and talents. In addition, the Declaration asserted freedom of religion and called for taxes to be levied according to ability to pay. Its principles were captured in the enduring slogan of the French Revolution: liberty, equality, fraternity. Many women were disappointed that the Declaration of the Rights of Man did not grant equal citizenship to them. In 1791, Olympie de Gouges, a journalist, demanded equal rights in her Declaration of the Rights of Woman and the Female Citizen. Woman is born free, she proclaimed, and her rights are the same as those of man. Therefore, Gouges reasoned, all citizens, be they men or women, being equal in the state's eyes, must be equally eligible for public offices, position, and jobs. Later in the Revolution, women met resistance for expressing their views in public, and many, including Gouges, were imprisoned and executed. The Declaration of the Rights of Man met resistance as well. Uncertain and hesitant, Louis XVI did not want to accept the reforms of the National Assembly. Nobles continued to enjoy gala banquets while people were starving. By autumn, anger turned to action. Women march on Versailles. On October 5th, about 6,000 women marched 13 miles in the pouring rain from Paris to Versailles. Bread, they shouted. They demanded to see the king. Much of the crowd's anger was directed at the Austrian-born Queen Marie Antoinette, daughter of Maria Theresa and brother of Joseph II. The Queen lived a life of great pleasure and extravagance, and this led to further public unrest. Although compassionate to the poor, her small acts went largely unnoticed because her lifestyle overshadowed them. She was against reforms and bored with the French court. She often retreated to Petit Trianon, a small chateau on the palace grounds at Versailles, where she lived her own life of amusement. The women refused to leave Versailles until the king met with the most important demand, to return to Paris. Not too happily, the king agreed. The next morning, the crowd, with the king and his family in tow, set out for the city. At the head of the procession rode women perched on the barrels of seized cannons. They told bewildered spectators that they were bringing Louis XVI, Marie Antoinette, and their son back to Paris. Now we won't go so far when we want to see our king, they sang. Crowds along the way cheered the king, who now wore the tricolor. In Paris, the royal family moved into the Tuileries Palace. For the next 3 years, Louis was a virtual prisoner. Checkpoint. How did the National Assembly react to peasant uprisings? The National Assembly presses onward. The National Assembly soon followed the king to Paris. Its large bourgeoisie members worked to draft a constitution to solve the continuing financial crisis. To pay off the huge government debt, much of it owed to the bourgeoisie, the assembly voted to take over and sell church lands. The church is placed under state control. In an even more radical move, the National Assembly put the French Catholic Church under state control. Under the civil constitution of the clergy, issued in 1790, bishops and priests became elected salaried officials. The civil constitution ended papal authority over the French Church and dissolved convents and monasteries. Reaction was swift and angry. Many bishops and priests refused to accept the civil constitution. The Pope condemned it. Large numbers of French peasants who were conservative concerning religion also rejected the changes. When the government punished clergy who refused to support the civil constitution, a huge gulf opened between revolutionaries in Paris and peasantries in the provinces. The Constitution of 1791 establishes a new government. The National Assembly completed its own task by producing a constitution. The Constitution of 1791 set up a limited monarchy in place of the absolute monarchy that had ruled France for centuries. A new legislative assembly had the power to make laws, collect taxes, and decide on issues of war and peace. Lawmakers would be elected by tax-paying male citizens over the age of 25. To make government more efficient, the Constitution replaced the old provinces with 83 departments of roughly equal size. It abolished the old provincial courts and reformed laws. To moderate reformers, the Constitution of 1791 seemed to complete the revolution. Reflecting Enlightenment goals, it ensured equality before the law for all male citizens and ended church interference in government. At the same time, it put power in the hands of men with the means and leisure to serve in government. Louis' escape attempt fails. Meanwhile, Marie Antoinette and others had been urging the king to escape their humiliating situation. Louis finally gave in. One night, in June 1791, a coach rolled north from Paris towards the border. Inside sat the king disguised as a servant, the queen dressed as a governess, and the royal children. The attempted escape failed. In a town along the way, Louis' disguise was uncovered by someone who held up a piece of currency with the king's face on it. A company of soldiers escorted the royal family back to Paris. His onlookers crowds hurled insults to the king. To many, Louis's dash to the border showed that he was a traitor to the revolution. What were the provisions of the Constitution of 1791? Radicals take over. Events in France stirred debate all over Europe. Supporters of the Enlightenment applauded the reforms of the National Assembly. They saw the French experiment as the dawn of a new age for justice and equality. European rulers and nobles, however, denounced the French Revolution. Rulers fear spread of revolution. European rulers increased border patrols to stop the spread of the French plague. Fueling those fears were the horror stories that were being told by the émergés, nobles and clergy, and others that had fled France on its revolutionary forces. Émigrés reported attacks on their privileges, their property, their religion, and even their lives. Even enlightened rulers turned against France. Catherine the Great of Russia burned Voltaire's letters and locked up her critics. Edmund Burke, a British writer and statesman who earlier had defended the American Revolution, bitterly condemned the revolutionaries in Paris. He predicted all too accurately that the revolutionaries would become more violent. Plots and assassinations, he wrote, will be anticipated by preventative murder and preventative confiscation. Burke warned, when ancient opinions and rules of life are taken away, we have no compass to govern us. Threats come from abroad. The failed escape of Louis XVI brought further hostile rumblings from abroad. In August 1791, the King of Prussia and Emperor of Austria, who was Marie Antoinette's brother, issued the Declaration of Pillnitz. In this document, the two monarchs threatened to intervene to protect the French monarchy. The declaration may have been mostly a bluff, but revolutionaries in France took the threat seriously and prepared for war. The revolution was about to enter a new, more radical phase of change and conflict. Radicals fight for power and declare war. In October 1791, the newly elected Legislative Assembly took office. Faced with crisis at home and abroad, it survived for less than a year. Economic problems fed renewed turmoil. Assignats, the revolutionary currency, dropped in value, causing prices to rise rapidly. Uncertainty about prices led to hoarding and caused additional food shortages. In Paris and other cities, working-class men and women, called sans-culottes, pushed the revolution into more radical action. They were called sans-culottes, which means without breeches, because they wore long trousers instead of fancy knee breeches the upper-class men wore. By 1791, many sans-culottes demanded a republic, or government ruled by elected representative instead of a monarch. Within the Legislative Assembly, several hostile factions competed for power. The sans-culottes found support among radicals in the Legislative Assembly, especially the Jacobins. A revolutionary political club, the Jacobins were mostly middle-class lawyers or intellectuals. They used pamphleteers and sympathetic newspaper editors to advance the Republican cause. Opposing the radicals were moderate reformers and political officials who wanted no more reforms at all. The National Assembly declares war on tyranny. The radicals soon held the upper hand in the Legislative Assembly. In April 1792, the war of words between French revolutionaries and European monarchs moved onto the battlefield. Eager to spread the revolution and destroy tyranny abroad, the Legislative Assembly declared war first on Austria and then on Prussia, Britain, and other states. The great powers expected to win an easy victory against France, a land divided by revolution. In fact, however, the fighting began in 1792, lasted on and off until 1815. Checkpoint. How did the rest of Europe react to the French Revolution? That's the end of Chapter 18, Section 2. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.